Hello, I'm King Link, and today we're going to talk about how does Outer Wilds work. Outer Wilds is a game released last year by Mobius Digital. If you haven't played it, it's a space exploration game. Your player is an astronaut, and they're about to be given a spacecraft to go to other planets in the star system and explore the worlds you'll find. Now, before we dive into Outer Wilds, I'm going to be theming this video with a focus on space exploration. I'm going to be talking about Outer Worlds a bit, which is a game from Obsidian Entertainment, but there's another example that we're going to talk about. If we say large-scale exploration, is there a specific game that comes to mind? One not regarded too well, let's say. For me, I have to talk about No Man's Sky by Hello Games. It's a perfect example of how not to do exploration, at least in my opinion. Now, out of these three games, only Outer Wilds really satisfies me with an exploration provided, and I struggle to understand why. Outer Worlds comes with an attempt to be somewhat like Fallout, which definitely rewarded players for exploration, but somehow Outer Worlds doesn't hit that same mark, and No Man's Sky is almost only exploration, but it doesn't work as well. So what makes Outer Wilds work when the other two falter? With that said, let's start talking about this. Now, I want to start with my first thoughts on Outer Wilds as the game starts. The fact is, you wake up on a planet and you start exploring the world. After meeting a couple of the people, you're going to notice something. These aren't people, at least not what humans would call people. That's because everyone you meet is an alien, and sure enough, if you look at your shadow, you are one of them too. Now, this is a minor piece of the game, but in just a few minutes, you're realizing that you're already exploring an unknown world, unknown galaxy, and an unknown universe. You are a Hearthian, and you might immediately start asking, what do they eat, how do they live, and more. Now, these are definitely good questions, and there are pieces of the game that start to hint at some of this information. It's not the focus, but it at least keeps you asking questions. The thing is, by not being a human, there's a possibility to discover something about your character just by starting in a character that you don't understand right off the bat. It's a minor change, but it also indicates a few other things. First off, any rule you understand about being a human is thrown out the window. You might know the possible maximum jump height of a character, the carry weight, how much damage a human might take when they do certain actions. None of that matters with Outer Wilds because, simply put, you're not human. Any preconceived rules about what is and isn't allowed can be safely ignored when the player is learning the actual rules of the game Outer Wilds. So now, what about the other two games? Let's take a look at Outer Worlds. And I know this is going to be a little complicated, Outer Wilds, Outer Worlds, but I think with looking at the video quickly, you can tell which game I'm actually saying. Hopefully it's not too confusing. Anyways, Outer Worlds. Starting with the character creator, Outer Worlds is a space RPG, but let's be very clear here. This isn't an alien RPG. You are on a different planet, different galaxy, and more, but there's not sentient aliens in Outer Worlds, at least none I've seen or heard about. If it wasn't for the colorful fauna and the alien creatures on these planets, I could make a case for this still being Earth. It's not, but the point is, it could be. And it's one of the disappointing parts of Outer Worlds. We can cross the galaxy or universe, potentially, but Outer Worlds tends to want to tell stories that we can already tell on Earth, with a focus on social issues and capitalism being bad and so on. I'm not going to go too much into the story here, just that is the stories that they tell, and it's stuff that could have been done on Earth and has been done on Earth in other games. If I'm honest, I think Fallout actually had more genetic diversity in their characters. Just having super mutants, deathclaws, and robots adds a lot more variety in the game. And it's a strange thing that Outer Worlds is so limited in the characters you encounter. There is a single major character in the game that's not fully human. At least that's what I remember. He's a companion and a robot named Sam, or Sam. I like Sam, but as a character, I didn't find him that interesting. The main quest revolving around him is just to recruit him, which he's not active during, and I don't think he does anything else, sadly, except say a few things like you're seeing on screen. Everyone else is human, not humanoid, but pure human, and I think something important is lost there. And then there is the true space game, No Man's Sky, and in No Man's Sky we have one of the harder problems with covering it. You see, No Man's Sky has changed a lot. It's one of the most patched $60 titles of all time, and there have been significant major patches to the game. Now, the problem here is that the game I originally played at launch and the game I played in last year, August 2019, no longer really exists. So if I claim something and it's true or not true, just consider if what I've said has ever been true. And please cut me a little slack for trying to cover a game in such a constant state of flux. With that said, when No Man's Sky first came out, you didn't have a race, if you will. I think it's safe to assume that you were probably a human, robot, or just a generic alien in the original game. There were 3 main alien races, but you couldn't speak any of their languages, so I think we could say you were something else. I do believe at one point you were called a traveler, but I don't know if that was after they announced the 4th race, the Travelers, or if that was the original name of whatever you were. Though without multiplayer, there were limited ways, if any, to even see yourself. I think at best you might be able to see yourself as you sat in a chair. All of this has changed, and I believe the next release, the one that added multiplayer components to the game, allowed players to start changing their race. Honestly, there's not a real reason for this, though. You can now choose to be one of 5 races, as you're going to see on the screen, but this only changes your appearance to other players. If you actually choose to become a Gek, you can talk to Gek aliens and still not understand their language. Similarly, if you change to any of the other 2 main alien races who had a language, you don't get a bonus for talking to them. And the Gek race is short, so your character should be short, but for some reason the camera angle seems to remain at full height. Really, this just becomes a cosmetic thing for multiplayer. And it's actually a shame because a 3 alien system in No Man's Sky could have been really interesting, and there is some significant discovery there. Let me just take a step in that direction for a moment. A big piece of exploration in No Man's Sky is understanding and discovering languages, and there are a few ways that this can work. The majority of them are to go to a monolith or go to creatures that you haven't visited before and ask them to give you a single word of their language. There are 4 languages, with the Atlas language being a 4th language. Well, there's 2,368 words in all these languages combined. The system relies on this process of collecting words one at a time, but the result is an understanding of what aliens are saying to you, and usually a minimal need for that understanding. The fastest way to gain knowledge is to fly to a space station, talk to the 8 or 10 NPCs on that station, and then quickly jump to the next system and talk to the next group on that space station. You can learn the languages in bursts in other ways as well, but we're almost always talking about a maximum of maybe 10 words at a time, and that's in the best of conditions. Realize 2,000 words is going to take you a massive amount of time to learn. The language, though, might even be a legacy system in my mind, as the use of words isn't very important in the game in more recent updates. In the Atlas Rising update, a new race was added to the game, the Travelers, like I mentioned, and the thing is, they don't have a learnable language. In fact, most NPCs really don't require their language for you to interface with them in any way. And it's a shame because the language system was actually an interesting part of the original game. It was one of the few parts that I actually enjoyed. Instead, it's been relegated to a minor system with a few uses, mostly focused on like chance encounters at another time. Now that is the initial look at each of these games, and I kind of wanted to see who you are in the game to kind of put you in perspective. Let's take a look at where the games are located, and by that I mean let's look at the worlds that they are played on. Let's start over again with Outer Wilds and see that there's actually a few worlds in Outer Wilds. This is the map of the game, and you can see a few grouping of planets and astral bodies. They'll all move in real time as well, which is an absolutely interesting feature and something that really makes the game fun. Each planet and astral body in Outer Wilds has some purpose, and each of the planets is interesting and unique when you land on them, as I'm going to be showing a couple scenes here. Almost every planet has a decent size, though they are quite a bit smaller than you might expect for a true planet. You'll find a large number of locations to discover on each planet. Every planet and location is unique and handcrafted, and almost all of them have some minor puzzle or purpose to discover within them. Now, I've been showing you small glimpses of interesting locations on these planets, but the one thing I noticed is how different each world is. Not only do they have a different color scheme, but they also look and act differently. You can see other planets from them, of course. You have a water planet, a forest planet, a moon with a minimal atmosphere, a desert planet, but that's not all. As I look up here, you should be able to see that this is what's known as the Hourglass Twins. And yes, that is a sand flow from the Ash Planet to the Ember Planet. What's even more interesting is if I'm careful, and I think I can do it here, I can ride that sand flow to the other planet. You see, the Hourglass Twins are binary planets, and while that is interesting in itself, their stories are also tied together. This is part of the wonder of Outer Wilds, in that each planet is tied together in a deeper, more meaningful purpose all across this galaxy. Now, let's check in again with Outer Worlds. There are actually several planets here too on this map, but does each planet look different is a question. And honestly, this is another of my issues with Outer Worlds. Let me explain a little bit. Outer Worlds has very small maps. They take like minutes to cross from one end to the other. On the other hand, the other two games show you the entire world, and well, it's very fake in that the entire world looks exactly the same, all forest, all rock, whatnot. Earth has the ability to have like deserts and forests and tundras and so on. In Outer Worlds, though, the worlds you see aren't very interesting, but they could easily have been on the same planet. However, the game just has you on different planets for some reason. The thing is, there's not many of these open world areas. There's about 4 large outdoor maps, if I remember correctly, not counting the city areas, large ships, and more. I think I could say that there's at least 6 or 7 large areas, but when I say they're large, again, minutes to cross each of them. Let me show you a third location. This is a small asteroid named Scylla, if I have said that right, and it's a little bit obvious that you're on an asteroid from the background and what you're seeing, but sure enough, when you start trying to jump on the planet, it doesn't feel very different than the rest of the game, and this is something that Outer Wilds does well. It also doesn't help that the buildings in Outer Worlds are all similar as well. It feels very cookie cutter. The game does try to make this seem like it's because one corporation is trying to ship low-cost housing, which makes sense, of course, but buildings on different planets look the same with minimal customization, except for certain locations like the bar. I mean, come on. The inside of the buildings also feel like they come from a small library of assets, and it doesn't make for a better experience for exploration. This is kind of a problem that Bethesda's engine had, and it was a common thing to say about all 3 of the games after Fallout 3, and I believe 76 has the same issue, but this isn't Bethesda's engine. It's a new engine from Obsidian, and we're seeing the same issues. Everything ends up looking the same. So, let's talk about No Man's Sky once more. Well, this is probably one of the better parts of No Man's Sky's game. There are different planets, and no 2 planets will look exactly the same, have the same wildlife or plants, and you can definitely explore each planet in the game. In fact, out of all 3 games, No Man's Sky's planets are easily the largest and potentially the most interesting. It's not densely packed with interesting locations though, but that's part of the charm of No Man's Sky's planets. The downside though is you're not supposed to stay on any of these planets for long. This is a game about quickly exploring the universe. To spend hours on a single planet outside of maybe a base doesn't seem that important. Players are going to want to continue their journey to the center of the universe, so they'll see many planets here. What is sad though is that almost any planet in No Man's Sky can be amazing. Every planet is different and unique, but none of these are handcrafted, and the system is impressive. You can see weird creatures like you're going to see on the screen, as well as unique rocks and vegetation and more. The problem though is after you quickly scan everything in that first landing zone, which will be only a fraction of the planet, but there's not much reason to stick around after that point. You'll want to accomplish whatever tasks brings you to that world and move on as soon as possible, usually after the first couple hours of amazement. No Man's Sky, though, does have more interesting planets than either of the other games mentioned, and potentially more than any other game ever made. But the problem is, while the player should want to explore those planets, the gameplay wants the player to move on relatively quickly, and there are far too many other planets to visit to focus on any one. Now, this has changed with the addition of construction, like mentioned, and players are free to do whatever they want with the game, but it's really hard to claim that fully exploring a planet in No Man's Sky is very rewarding outside of an achievement or just a little number incrementing on the screen. While a single planet is interesting here, as the game progresses, there's not many unique planets. Most planets have animals with 2 or 4 feet, they might have birds, and they may or may not be hostile. They're interesting, but after 5 or 10 minutes, they all seem to be the same. The snake-like creature I found before was a very unique find, but a majority of these creatures will look and act and feel the exact same, which does harm the feeling of exploration when you aren't finding anything that feels very new at each location. And one last point about No Man's Sky, and it's a minor one, but every planet in No Man's Sky feels the same size. It's really interesting to move around at an asteroid or a moon in Outer Wilds and feel a different gravitational pull. But in No Man's Sky, as shown on the screen, this is a moon, but it and every planet is about the same size, and they feel similar in that way. Though, like I said, I think No Man's Sky and planets and biodiversity is easily the best. I just wish there was a little bit more scale difference. Now, let's talk about the one last thing, the real exploration of each game. And this really ties to the main story of each game. Now, Outer Wilds once again uses a handcrafted nature of the world to produce a deeper story. There's quite a lot to go through, and I don't want to talk too much here, but very minor spoilers, stuff that happens in the first hour. In Outer Wilds, at the beginning of the game, as you get your launch codes for your spaceship and you leave, you run into the statue. It's called a Nomai statue, and, well, something happens. But what? Much of Outer Wilds actually focuses on learning about the Nomai and what has happened to the civilization, as well as what's going on with you from the statue. There's no Nomai in your star system anymore. Something has happened to them, but the player's left to figure out what. And there's actually a little problem also happening around the galaxy, as you're going to see on the screen. Every 22 minutes or so, the suns that all the planets are revolving around goes supernova, and suddenly you have to start over. 22 minutes is both exceedingly long and very short depending on what you're doing. I honestly didn't reach the supernova death due to a lot of stupid deaths before that for a couple hours early on, but at the same time, when you're working on a problem and get reset because of that sun death, it can be a little frustrating. But that sun death means every minute of the game is important, and it makes you focus on exploration. The good news is that even if you learn something at that last moment before you die, from whatever cause, your computer will magically remember all that information, so you can just look at the computer on your spaceship to study where the story is or what important information you might have missed. It even tells you when there's more information to find at a location. The thing is, the huge narrative that Outer Wilds expects the player to find is contained and localized to that one large screen when reviewing the information, and it's very helpful. At the same time, players will usually have to cross the galaxies all over multiple loops. Often they'll have to understand something from one location and then return to another one to use that knowledge, maybe even returning again to the first one with more information in hand. There's a lot of detail and care in the creation of the world and the narrative made here, and that's what makes the exploration of Outer Wilds, the worlds, the themes, and the story really stand out, because each step feels both important and part of a larger picture that keeps the player asking what they're going to find and eventually will understand next. Outer Worlds, on the other hand, seems to be more focused on the rummage style of exploration. After the first couple of areas and quests in Outer Worlds, I realized that the story wasn't going to be exploring themes at a deep level. Much of the game is focused on the story of capitalism gone wrong, as I mentioned. The problem is, this is more of a blunt hammer than an interesting discovery as you go along in the story. Instead, it seems that Outer Worlds wants you to explore these outer worlds, which would be fine, of course. One of the great joys of Fallout 3 was to explore the wasteland and even just scavenge in random locations. Outer Worlds seems to want to lead you down the same path. The only problem is Outer Worlds doesn't have enough of this. Almost every location on your map will have some purpose in a quest or a story, so you eventually have to go everywhere to complete every quest. There's very few random encounters or random experiences or such as a player, and I felt that I was pulled more towards completing quests than truly exploring a vast wilderness. Part of this was that the maps in the game are relatively small scale and uninteresting, but a big part was that nothing in the game encourages true exploration until you're being sent to a location on purpose. Otherwise, you might be investigating an area and then in a few minutes be sent back to that area to do some minor task. And it actually has happened to me twice in the game. It's not a particularly enjoyable experience to trudge back to a location you've already been in. Looking at the levels in the game after finishing the game, I don't really remember a single location that isn't used for some plot point that I had seen. So where's the real exploration of this game? There are generic buildings all over the place, but these are going to have typical loot and small-scale stuff. There's nothing interesting to find in them, not even logs. Compare this to like Fallout or Skyrim, where the players can stumble on entire quest lines by going to some interesting looking building that they've passed by a couple times or just found on one of their many walks. And let's talk about No Man's Sky as well and what's going on there. As I mentioned, it has one of the most interesting series of planets to explore, but that's just one system as part of it. There are now multiple quest systems leading the player to a lot of interesting content, but this takes us away from really exploring a single interesting planet. There's also construction mechanics and the ability to feed animals, possibly riding them as you should be seeing now, and now space freighter systems as well. This is right next to a big issue I have with No Man's Sky. There's a huge number of systems in No Man's Sky, but none of them really mesh or connect well. You can play multiplayer, but unless you agree to never leave each other's side, you're going to quickly be pulled away from each other. You can feed an animal, but why? Because after you ride them, that's about all you can seem to do. You can explore a planet fully, which is interesting to do once or twice, but that means you're ignoring multiple other systems pulling you away from it. You can follow the story, that means you probably won't be spending much time on any planet. There's so many things to do in No Man's Sky, but there's very little synergy between all these systems. Compare this to Outer Worlds, where the player can be sent to a factory for a quest, they can then fight enemies there, discover some story on the computer, and other features, as well as scavenged loot and more. And while there are choices, such as if you find the quest item really early, or you can then choose to explore that area, or decide to return to the quest giver, but when you enter that location, you have multiple pieces of the game all working on you at the same time. No Man's Sky's multiple methods of gameplay and exploration drift off in vastly different directions. If anything, there's just way too much to do, and each system gives you a shallow experience on its own. Fully exploring this planet gives you that few credits, and that's about it. Completing a major quest in No Man's Sky results in an abrupt ending usually. Reaching the center of the galaxy still results in a restart for the entire game, and not much more. You see, there's no real benefit for many of these systems in No Man's Sky, and that's a continual problem that hasn't been addressed after many of these patches. Rather than create a purpose for all manners of exploration already in the game, whether it be the befriending of animals, reaching the center of the galaxy, which was in the original game, or completing these new quest lines, which have been added over time, instead Hello Games has provided additional methods of exploration. And, you know, some of these new methods have worked out. I've heard the Living Ship questline now gives you something very new and unique at the end of its path. But that doesn't help the fact that much of No Man's Sky seems to pull you away from the other versions of exploration in the game to do something new. Or in the case of the language system, just completely negating it during some update. Hello Games has done this instead of attempting to tie the entire experience of No Man's Sky into a few specific styles of the game. The game now has purposefully offered too much to the player so they feel that there's tons to do, and it renders many of these systems into one-off experiences because once you've befriended an animal, why do you really feel the need to befriend others? Same thing with getting freighters. Once you do that, it kind of ruins a few of the other subsystems before it. So what can we learn from these three games? Honestly, I would put Outer Wilds as a shining example of how to do an exploration gameplay. It has a great depth to the experience, you're always going to find something new, a lot to see, understand, and a firm focus on providing something to the experience at all points, rather than trying to pull the player away to other types of experiences like shooting and all that. On the other hand, Outer Worlds really does try to revisit what made the Fallout games interesting. The numerous locations, the large sense of exploration of an unknown area, and the vast world to conquer. But Outer Worlds seems to focus on the first point, the numerous locations, rather than the rest, and it leaves the player underwhelmed by the amount of stuff that they have. While there are a few different worlds here, the variety and look of most of the locations are so similar, and the fact that each location was created with a specific quest or story purpose that players are going to be led to by the hand, means that the exploration is a secondary purpose to the entire game. And finally, No Man's Sky. You know, it has been said so many times that No Man's Sky has some of the best potential for an interesting game, but poor execution, and I'm going to repeat that because it's true. The exploration at the core of No Man's Sky absolutely could have worked, but so much of it's being done in such a shallow way, like so many of its systems, that while the exploration works, there's nothing that can't be accomplished by just seeing slides of a random planet. It also doesn't help that every planet has to have certain goods so that if a player gets stranded on them for some reason, they're able to get off the planet as well to move on with the game. Out of the 3 games here, only Outer Wilds truly embraces the exploration at its core, and that's because the game was deliberately made for it. The other 2 attempted to have exploration, but don't provide enough locations specifically for exploration in the case of Outer Worlds, or too much as in the case of No Man's Sky, and leaves it at that for players. It renders both of their exploration systems as an afterthought, almost as if it was a checkbox that had to be ticked off. It's also why when I play Outer Wilds, I first thought, this is what I've been looking for, a deep, meaningful exploration. The ability to dive into the deeper world and explore it is something many games seem to promise, but so few take the time to properly develop into a full experience. Now, as a last-minute addition, I do want to call out one other game, Return of the Obra Dinn by Lucas Pope. It also does a lot of exploration right. It's a weird, strange game that I have few other opinions on, but the ship and the flashbacks the game provides creates an interesting sense of exploration. With the focus on the past of the ship, it uses time rather than location as the major aspect of its exploration of the ship itself. Now, I hope this has at least started some thoughts on how exploration may or may not be working in the games that you're playing, or what can be done to enhance the feeling of exploration in the game. Admittedly, we haven't even started to discuss how to create locations for exploration that are interesting to explore, but I'm going to be leaving it here and perhaps dive deeper into this topic another day in the future. Thank you very much for watching this far. If you've made it here, something I've said must have spoken to you, or you just left the video running. Either way, thank you. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. I try to make these videos as often as I can, so ring that bell to be notified when I make my next video. I have something special for the beginning of next month. I'll be popping up my latest video, a look at Shovel Knight and its DLC, as well as a video on Void Bastards, yet another space game, though that one's talking more about roguelite mechanics. Until then, I'm King Link, and thank you for watching.